apologize for the emotional and raw footage that you just saw. And there's another part of me that feels that, no, that's a very, very important part of your education. For those of us who are old enough to remember 9/11, when it happened, which wasn't that long ago, you were babies, I'm sure none of you remember it, but ask your parents and their friends. Every single one of them knows where they were when they heard that the World Trade Center was hit, and where they were when they realized it wasn't a small plane that was lost. It was an act of terrorism on the soil of the United States, aimed against American people. And it was really when the second plane hit that we realized that. It was a horrific day. There were 2 other planes that went down, one in a field in Pennsylvania brought down by the people on board, and another one that went into the Pentagon. Guesses are that the plane that was brought down in Pennsylvania was heading for the White House, but we don't know. We just don't know. 3,000, 4,000 people were killed that day. I think the number actually went downward at a certain point. Thank God it wasn't as much as many people as they had predicted, but the literal and figurative mess that ensued after that moment took days to literally dig out from under, literally dig out. The rescue effort lasted for a very long time, and at a certain point we understood we were looking for bodies. I was not there. They understood they were looking for bodies, but for the first day or two they were looking for survivors. They were looking for people to go to the hospital. And among those first reporters to the scene, were several Hatzalah members who came from wherever they were, and were, I can't say lucky, because lucky would have been for 9/11 not to have happened, but in light of the circumstances, we are lucky to have Ben Diamond join us today, who is Coach K's brother, and was one of the first people to be at the World Trade Center. I'm not going to share my own experiences this year, because I think Mr. Diamond's experiences far out trump mine of watching that. All I did really was watch that footage again and again and again and again and again on endless cycle. I'm not an artist, but if I were, I could probably sketch the falling of the towers by heart, still, 15 years later. So if you could please join us, ladies, please show kavod to Mr. Diamond.
So good morning. I would say that it's been 15 years, and this is the first year that I agreed to speak regarding my experiences on September 11th. My sister pulled the sibling card and convinced me to speak. September 11th, 2001, I was 18 years old. You do the math, you can figure out how old I am now. I was a junior in Yeshiva University. I just gotten back from Eretz Yisrael, completed my sophomore year. January of 2000, I started my journey as a public servant and a first responder. I joined my local fire department in West Hempstead. I just completed my EMT training and fought the hard battle to get myself onto Hatzalah in Washington Heights up in YU. I joined literally 3 weeks before September 11th. We had just started orientation, and I had just gotten my Hatzalah radio, and was actually just learning the lingo, and taken about, at that point, 25 calls on Hatzalah before September 11th happened. It's said in many books, said all over, that everyone from that day remembers exactly where they were when they heard the news and what was going on. And my experience is very similar to many others. But what I want to try to do today is, other than all the footage that exists, but able to convey what a personal experience is like for those who went through the day, and really bring home the message that September 11th wasn't just a day in history. Just by a show of hands, how many people were alive on September 11th, 2001? Okay? How many people were able to recall any of the events of that day? Okay? These are the first years, as we commemorate September 11th, that it's not a unanimous raising of the hands. Just to put things in perspective, okay, the iPhone 7 was just released. Okay, there was no iPhones back then. Blackberries were not all over the place. There was no such things as smartphones. There was barely camera phones. You were the coolest kid on campus when you had the smallest flip phone. Okay, we had just made the transition from pagers to phones. We actually had to carry a cheat sheet with us for the pagers because we had a language that we used to use on pagers. That's crazy, right? Think about the dynamic shift in the last 15 years. If September 11th, Chas v'Shalom would happen today, there would be millions upon millions of people with footage of what transpired. The footage that you saw was captured with actual video cameras. Okay, completely different time in this world. So September 11th, 2001, we were approaching Rosh Hashanah. It was Elul, it was already Slichos, even for Ashkenazim. So we were a week before Rosh Hashanah. I was in my dorm room at YU, just completed Shacharis and Slichos. I was not a very social eater in the morning. The YU cafe could be quite the buzz, and I liked a little bit of quiet time before Shir. So oddly enough, I was sitting in my dorm room watching the news. I even remember what I had for breakfast that day. And as I was sitting there, as I did every morning, my Hatzalah radio was on my desk next to me. Back then, it was about 2.5 times the size, and it weighed about 10 pounds. You could always tell a Hatzalah member, even when they didn't have their radio on them, because their belt had a sag on the side that they carried their radio. It was questionable whether it had to be considered a weapon. That's how heavy it was. And the shrill tone came over the radio that I had not heard before. Now, mind you, it was 3 weeks. But like any good Hatzalah guy who wanted to get on Hatzalah, we had scanners and we practiced listening before we even got onto Hatzalah. My sister can actually remember hearing me listening. She goes, "What are you listening to that for? You're not even on Hatzalah yet." And the tone came over the radio, and it was a long, shrill tone. And the first tone was literally telling everyone else who was talking on the radio to stop talking. There was a Hatzalah member down at what we now call Ground Zero at the World Trade Center who saw debris flying out of the towers. He didn't see the initial impact because of the angle that the plane came in, but he saw this burst of debris coming down at Ground Zero. And his first reaction was to pick up the radio and call for help. He called dispatcher and said, "I need ambulances and I need people to come. There's a lot of people hurt." That was the first call for help. Okay, as people picking up whatever cell phones they had or actually running to a payphone, right? Not everyone had cell phones. They were running to call 911. A Hatzalah member was there and instantly putting out the call for additional help. Now, you would, just if you know a little geography of Manhattan, Ground Zero is almost at the southernmost tip of Manhattan. There's a couple of blocks, I know, because I had to run those couple of blocks to the water on September 12th. We'll get there in a little bit. Okay? And Washington Heights is almost at the most northern tip. There's over 180 blocks between the two locations. Quite a bit of a distance. But we knew almost from the very first moment that call went to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher was just repeating what we heard. We couldn't even hear what the other side of the conversation was. That we were facing an emergency like has not been faced since the first World Trade Center bombing in '93. Yes, that's something that most of you don't even hear about or know about. Okay? And I remember that day as well. Wasn't old enough to respond yet, but I remember that day as well. And then came the tone. The dispatcher had stopped all else. There were no other calls going out. It was very eerie because you usually hear, do we have any units in Queens? Do we have any units in Borough Park? These are the normal chatter of the day. People, Rahman al-Assan, needing a Yeshua, people needing someone to come and save them from what could be a very, very serious emergency for them on a personal level. We now had a national tragedy on our hands. The next tone came out, and we knew what was going on. It was a confirmed report of a plane into the World Trade Center. Now, most people who are wired normally would think, wow, a plane just hit the World Trade Center? supposed to be a very dangerous place to go. But those who are first responders, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us a little bit of a miswiring. Okay? Same way when we join the fire department, everyone's running out of the house and the firemen run into the house. You have to be wired slightly different to be able to react that way. And there were 5 of us at YU who reacted that way. And without hesitation, without thought, without a second of ponderance as to whether or not we would be putting ourselves into harm's way, we all came running. Now, what did coming running mean? YU, Baruch Hashem, is a pretty spread out campus. It doesn't look like a campus. It's one of the few campuses in Manhattan that you actually have street traffic through. But it's a campus nonetheless. I was in my dorm room on the 7th floor of Reuben Hall. One day, if you end up going to Stern, you'll know where Reuben Hall is. And I come running. And 4 other of my fellow Hatzalah members come running, and we all converge at the ambulance, and we jump on the ambulance. Now, the plane hit. Does anyone know what time the first plane hit? See how much you pay attention to the footage? Second plane, what time? 8:43.
I was going to say 8:47, but 8:43.
So, about between, depending which timing reports and which camera footage you go, let's call it 8:47. Okay? By 8:49, we were on the ambulance on the way down the West Side Highway. Okay? Only because it took that long to run to the ambulance. Now, the drive from Upper Manhattan to the Lower Manhattan, anyone who tries to travel Manhattan can tell you, it could be a 10-minute drive, and it could be an hour drive. We made it down from Washington Heights to Lower Manhattan in about 9 minutes that day. What happened? The world literally froze. And New York City is called the city that never sleeps. You will never find a time that New York City is not abuzz with traffic, with cars flying in all different directions. The West Side Highway was literally at a standstill. People were standing outside of their cars, looking down towards Manhattan, wondering what has just happened. We're flying down the West Side Highway. I was a newbie, so the back of the ambulance. If anyone's seen the ambulance, there's this little sliver between the front and the back. And I was not much smaller then than I am today. And I'm crouched in between, trying to see what we're going into. And as I'm looking through the windshield, as we're coming down, it's no longer the West Side Highway, we're already on West Street. We're already almost down by J&R Music World. That's pretty close to ground zero. We see a ball of fire explode. We catch the tail of the plane as it hits the second tower. I remember my first thought to my fellow Hatzalah members is any thought that this was an accident is gone. Now, it couldn't be that it's an accident. How do you hit a large tower with lights flashing on one of the clearest days of record? Okay? They stick up 2 twin towers clear for miles. The fact that anyone would think that the first plane was an accident was really, really just a tefillah that it should just be an accident and not something Rahman al-Islam works. However, when we saw the second plane hit, we knew without a shadow of a doubt that we were driving into a war zone. Okay? The oldest guy on the ambulance that day was 20 years old. Okay? So you had a bunch of 19 and 20-year-olds, not much older than you guys, driving into a war zone, not knowing what to expect, not knowing what we're going to encounter. Just moments later, we heard our friends from the West Side Hatzalah Division screaming for help. They had literally a pool of patients of 40 people that had been dragged from just a few blocks away, and they were screaming for further assistance. The first patient I treated that day, I'll never forget this, had the imprint of a shoe on their forehead as they were knocked unconscious. He's 19 years old, and I just encountered a person who was knocked unconscious by a shoe falling from the World Trade Center. I was just eating breakfast. I was just thinking about how am I going to pay attention in Shir that morning. And now I'm dealing with someone who was knocked unconscious by a shoe that came from the World Trade Center. A shoe. Could you imagine the picture of an imprint of a shoe on someone's forehead? Now that shoe came down over 70 stories. wasn't a little bit of an indent like when you wear a shoe for too long, or your friend stepped on your foot. Okay? There was literally a crater in the person's skull from the shoe that hit them. So we did what we're trained to do. We picked them up, we put them on the stretcher, and we drove them to the hospital. Now there's process in everything that goes on in life, and we're told that you have to give patient information, you have to write paperwork to document what's going on. But as you can imagine, we're in war. There was no paperwork at that time. We brought them into the hospital, and when we did what our gut told us was the right thing to do, get back out there and go help people. In the first 25 minutes from the time that the second plane hit and our arrival, I treated roughly 25 patients. These patients were, if you can call them, the lucky ones. The people who weren't trapped in the building, the people who were hit by falling debris, the people who were injured as they tried running away from that initial impact. We thought, man, this is really bad. There's a lot of people that we have to help. But really, what's the danger to us? Okay. We had helmets. We put helmets on. We were mindful as to where we were going, where we were. And we thought, hey, we're a block or two away. We're evacuating patients from there. We'd be safe. After our third trip to the hospital, we set up at a triage station on the corner of John and Vesey, right outside of a Walgreens. The wall was roughly 100 feet long outside this Walgreens. It was one of many triage locations where people were bringing patients to determine who, in what priority, had to go to the hospital. Even if all the ambulances in the city of New York had converged simultaneously, there were not enough ambulances to take all the patients at the same time. There were roughly 200 plus Hatzalah responders there over the course of the first 2 days. So I'm there with another 20 Hatzalah guys as we're triaging these patients by this Walgreens. And I'll never forget the moment. I'm taking a patient who's in shock, physical shock, psychological shock. You can't imagine what it does to a person's conscience and their brain when you go from coming down to go to work and witnessing and feeling what it's like to planes impacting. If you ever walked down the street in Manhattan and you felt the subway go underneath your feet and you felt that little rumble, imagine that 1,000 times stronger. Okay? As those planes were coming, if you've ever gone to an air show and you've seen these jets go flying by, as you're sitting there, your seats vibrate. You can feel that roar of the plane go. Imagine that roar as it's coming into downtown Manhattan, the vibration of the plane at full throttle coming to hit a building. So this woman that I'm loading into the ambulance looks and just starts screaming. You feel the ground start to vibrate. Thought in my head, well, which building's next? Right? Well, they just hit the World Trade Center. They hit both towers. Are they coming to hit them again to try to knock them down? What's next? And the rumble gets greater and greater. And I realized that maybe I need to divert my attention from the patient that I'm working with as she's screaming louder and louder. And I look up. And what seemed like right over my head, John and Vesey is about a block from the site of the World Trade Center. I see this black cloud just starting to descend over Lower Manhattan. So some of you have already taken physics and understand the concept of gravity. Okay? Things accelerate as they come to the ground, and a building that big, as debris falls, it's naturally displacing itself and getting bigger and bigger. And the only way I could describe it is if you read the Mefarshim when it comes to the description of Choshech, that there was this descension of Choshech that was so great and so powerful that it was physically and mentally debilitating. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't move because that's how fearful you felt. That's how just complete your brain goes numb. and the instinct of fight or flight kicks in. And you look up and you say, well, what's my chances of outrunning a building that's that tall? And there was a number of us standing there on the street together, and many people said, well, I'm running for it. I said, I don't have a chance. It's genetic that we have bad knees in our family. I knew I didn't have a chance of outrunning this building. I said, what about all these people who need my help? What am I supposed to do with them? So I'm standing by the ambulance and have a choice. Many of my friends ran that day. Many people that I was working alongside ran that day. Many of the people who ran that day are not here today. They were caught by the debris as it was coming down. Somehow, only through the Ratzon HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I mentioned there was 20 Hatzalah guys with me at that spot. 4 of us decided to stay. The 16 that ran, as they're running, people are getting knocked over left and right as they're running arm in arm. A good friend of mine was running next to a fireman and to a police officer. You can't explain these things, especially when you think about the physics of what transpired. They were not a foot and a half apart. My friend from Hatzalah kept running. Next thing he knew, the 2 people who were running with him are not there. They got caught by the debris as it was coming down. So I jumped in an ambulance. Thought, if I have any chance, the ambulance is made of steel. Maybe it'll help. Maybe the trajectory in the building. I wasn't doing any equations that day to try to figure out what my chances of survival were. I had an ambulance full of people who needed my attention and my help. So we're in the back of the ambulance, hearing a deafening thud as pieces of concrete, steel, and other objects we could only seem to guess were banging on the ambulance. If that wasn't scary enough, we see from all directions this dark, thick cloud trying to push its way into our ambulance. Now, I knew HaKadosh Baruch Hu had given me many brachos that day. One of them was the fact that I was already about 8 months into my fire training, and I had learned certain survival aspects from being a firefighter. I knew to quickly take and close whatever doors we could, and I wet sheets and put them at every possible place that we were afraid that smoke could come in. We cut the ventilation system, and we basically tried to build a barrier between ourselves and this horrific cloud that has enveloped us. I had 4 patients in the back of the ambulance. One of them had a collapsed lung. Having trouble breathing. Patient sitting next to them was in the process of having a heart attack. At least that's what we suspected. We need to put them on oxygen too. Person on the stretcher, they're having an asthma attack. They can't breathe either. They needed oxygen. The other person was an elderly woman with emphysema. They couldn't breathe either. We had a predicament though. Hatzalah ambulance is usually designed to take 1 patient at a time. So we had an oxygen tank inside the ambulance. I had 4 people who needed oxygen at the same time. I had 1 tank. It was a fundamental math problem. So I remember sitting there with an oxygen tank between my legs, and I'm counting to 30, giving each person 30 seconds of oxygen, rotating. And the pounding gets greater and greater. And I said, well, 19 years old, was a good boy in high school. Good boy in Eretz Yisrael. Eagerly awaiting my time to hopefully finish college and start a family, get married, do the things that that every person aspires to at the ripe old age of 20. I was a little bit of, my sister would say I'm a little bit of a mature before my time type of individual. 19-year-old guy already thinking about getting married. But at that moment, I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking that this ambulance was going to be my coffin. And I said, I have to do whatever Yid's supposed to do at the moment that they think that their life is coming to an end. And as I'm giving people oxygen, and I see the ambulance's roof getting dented further and further, I said, Kriya Shema. Oddly enough, at that very moment, our mother was working in the town. I mentioned there's no smartphones. Text messaging was really a thing that we didn't really know about at the time. There was no Facebook. WhatsApp was a what's that? We had no means of communication. We had phones. So my mother called me. Now, in case you guys aren't aware of how this technology works, cell phones require cell towers in order to relay that signal, right? So in order for you to have the data in your phone to work, in those days it was just voice communication, but you needed towers. The way these towers work is you're supposed to put them in the highest vantage point because it allows for the signal to give its greatest reach. Well, where do you think those signals were? Where do you think those towers were? Where do you think those signals were coming from? On top of a building that wasn't there. So my mother's leaving me a voicemail telling me, Benjamin, don't worry. I'm 30 blocks, I'm in Midtown, I'm not in downtown. And I got the timestamp of that message when it finally came through. It was at the exact same moment that I was saying Kriya Shema and Vidui, wondering if I would ever see my family again. Alongside many other people who had come to help people without a thought of their own safety, without taking a moment to wonder, am I going to someplace for my last time? Am I treating my life in order to be able to help someone else on the chance that I'll be able to save someone? So I said Vidui. I said Kriya Shema. And I was still there. I said, you know what? I'm going to keep saying Tehillim. And I kept saying whatever Tehillim I could remember by heart as I was trying to treat the patients in the back of the ambulance. And if my own plight wasn't scary enough, my chavrusa, who I rode the ambulance down to Ground Zero with, comes over the radio, screaming that he's trapped in a building. It's on fire. It's filling with smoke. He has no place to go. He's trapped. What is he supposed to do? Someone come please help. Can you imagine that paralyzing moment when you realize that your chavrusa, your friend, not strangers that you're coming down. I mean, these are complete strangers. Never seen these people before in my life. Don't know who they are. The other Hatzalah guys that I'm in the ambulance with, maybe I saw, it's 3 weeks in Hatzalah. I don't even know that they exist. Maybe I heard their number on the radio. And my chavrusa is screaming that he's trapped. The place is filling with smoke. Another guy whose voice I recognize from the radio as a dispatcher is screaming that the building he's in is on fire. He's trapped. Sure enough, they're together. Come help. Dispatcher does what any dispatcher would. Do we have any units who can help? We have units trapped on fire. And I'll never forget the next voice that came over. The Hatzalah dispatcher is known as H-Base. And the next voice on the radio was, H-Base, we're all trapped. One by one, each person said, tell my wife that I love her. The simple bakasha that came from those who ran there today, on that very day, was simply to relay to others, don't be sorry for us, we went al Kiddush Hashem. We were there at that very moment. Our thoughts were no longer upon us and our own well-being. What would it mean to our families if we didn't come home that day? It's said every year, most neighborhoods have a very wise and very important very important practice. Every year, the membership gets together. And the point of the gathering is not for the Hatzalah members. Hatzalah members, especially those who are active, see each other on calls. We have the zchus of doing shlichus for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be matzal nefesh, fulfill the greatest mitzvah of the kuach nefesh. But the greatest sacrifice for someone who's a first responder, Hatzalah is no exception, is that of the families. At the very least, the person who's running to be matzal nefesh maybe has some chance of in some way guiding whether or not they'll be safe at the moment or not. But the family that he's running out from, the family that he's leaving behind, all they can do is sit and wonder, is my husband coming home? Is my Abba coming home? Now you would think that someone who joins a volunteer ambulance squad, that fear shouldn't be great. September 11th was a very scary day for all the first responders. But if you want to know what pain is, you want to know what fear is, talk to the families of the first responders. There was no communication. Hours and hours went by. Family members of Hatzalah were calling the dispatcher, begging, pleading, please find out if my son, my husband, is okay. The hours after the collapse were the most eerie sight and feeling you could ever feel. There was no communication. No one knew what was going on. No one knew if the person that they were just standing next to was still alive. There was this unmistakable choshech all over great downtown Manhattan. You simply couldn't move. You just couldn't move. But we had to do something. If we just sat there, we were just sitting ducks. If one tower could come down, what about the second tower? We were still here after the collapse of the first tower. If the second tower comes down, we may not be so lucky. We made one of the hardest decisions we had to make, and we decided that we were going to start driving. That meant going out into Choshech for one of us to get into the driver's seat of the ambulance. And to start driving, not knowing what we were going to encounter, barely knowing what direction. Waze did not exist back then. There was no Google Maps. Apple Maps was not even thought of. MapQuest, if you were lucky, was the thing that you used to take with you. Print it out. You used to have to fight with your parents whether to print in color or not, with the map or without the map. And we started driving to the closest hospital. And then came more thuds. These thuds were different. They weren't coming from the roofs. They were coming from the side of the ambulance. As we're driving through Choshech and people see the flashing lights of the ambulance, people started banging on the ambulance, begging for a lifeline, begging that there was some indication that they had a chance of getting out from this horrific existence that they were trapped in. One by one, we started packing people into the ambulance. To give you a visual, if you've ever gone to the circus and seen the clown car with people piled in, getting out and getting more and more coming out, that was the scene when we got to the hospital. We packed 15 people into the back of the ambulance that day. People were sitting on top of people and sitting on top of people, and we weren't just talking about people just to give people a thrill. These were all people who were sick and injured. Then came another knock. It was my chavrusa. My chavrusa ran. He knew that the building he was in wasn't safe, and he had to take a chance. My chavrusa was at the back door of the ambulance. He was covered, head to toe, with the horrible dust. At that moment, I couldn't see anyone else. I grabbed my chavrusa by his shirt and pulled him into the ambulance. We started rinsing him off with whatever water we could. We gave him oxygen. My chavrusa who came down that day to help others was now in need of the help himself. We drove people that day to the hospital. We packed them all out. Now, what would the same person do after finally getting out of ground zero? We just rescued people. And I told you I treated 25 people beforehand. I just escaped burial in the ambulance that I was in to help people. And we just rescued another 15 people. Our ambulance was so badly damaged that we were afraid if we turned the engine off, it wouldn't start again. And we said there's not even a shadow of a doubt that where we belong is returning back to the very location that we nearly died. Because there was more people who needed help. How many more thuds would come? How many more people would be looking for an ambulance as their lifeline, as their only hope of a Yeshua from that very day? And we went back. On the way back, the second tower came down. That choshech just extended further, became even deeper and harder to move forward. We had to stop. We were redirected to a staging area.
I just want to clarify. I think when you're talking about Choshech, you used it before as a metaphor, as it felt as if it was the Choshech of Mitzrayim, but there actually was a fog of debris that you were actually driving through. It actually looked like nighttime, even
Yes.
though it was broad daylight.
You could not see.
Right, you
If I
could
held my
not
hand
see.
here, you could not see.
It was actually,
You could not see. You were
Dense.
running, you had no idea where you were running. You were driving, you had no idea where you were driving. You could not see your hand in front of your face. I'm not talking about nighttime here. Imagine a night with no stars, no moon, no source of light whatsoever.
yeah, even if the light was on, it would just reflect back at you because of the density of there was garbage in the air. Papers flying, pieces of the building.
We didn't know where to turn anymore. Some semblance of organization within the chaos was finally starting to take hold. This was a mass casualty incident that no one had ever fathomed, no one ever had planned for, no one knew how to even handle. The areas that we thought were safe were no longer safe. Places that were set up to help people, those people were now victims themselves. And it became a wait-and-see game. We waited for hours upon hours upon hours upon hours, hoping that there would be more patients, more people that we could help. Those minutes turned to hours, probably the worst hours of a person's life, not knowing what would happen next, what would come next. Every sound caused everyone to jump. And then we waited. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, it became clear that enough cavalry had arrived from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and it was time for those who had been involved in the initial phase of response to clean up. I'll never forget going back to my dorm room in YU. My pants were filled with debris. My cuffs. You know, it says that when you're cleaning for Pesach, you should turn your cuffs and empty them, right? Because chametz gets caught in them. I had building in my cuffs of my pants. And what I didn't know at that time was I had building in my lungs and in my stomach. We cleaned up, we slept for 2 hours, we restocked the ambulance, and we drove back down to ground zero. They needed us. We were right next to the pile on September 12th. Everything stopped every time someone was found, with the hope that we were having a chance to rescue somebody. On September 12th, I only transported rescuers. People who were hurt, trying to get through the pile. A pile like you could never fathom or imagine. The scale of what you cannot possibly really understand from seeing it on a video. a pile of rubble so high that it looked like a high-rise building. And then the shaking happened again. There was another building that was unstable. And all we heard was the word run. Run, run for the water. Could you imagine? We survived 2 collapses. Now we have to worry about a third. All you heard was the blaring sounds of the sirens of the fire trucks and ambulances, warning everyone to run. We did. That time I ran. We ran for the water. We got the Battery Park. We jumped over the side of the railing meant to keep people from falling over onto waiting boats to rescue the rescuers yet again of fear of another collapse. That was the last time I was at Ground Zero. I thought my journey with that day was over. Came back to my dorm room after a very interesting route to get back home. We left the ambulance there. I got back to my dorm room and I said, okay, time to get cleaned up. Time to try to go back to whatever we call normal and process what it is that we had just experienced. Never forget davening in Mincha at Ground Zero with masks on. I got back to my dorm room and I bagged up those clothes. And then the cough came. Started coughing that day. I haven't stopped since. 9/11 on the footage, 9/11 for many people is a day. 9/11 for people who were there, for many of the first responders, is now their life. I was fortunate, if you can imagine. I developed 9/11 respiratory syndrome. No one knew what that was. I had GERD. I just thought suddenly I couldn't drink orange juice anymore. I had perpetual asthma attacks. My lungs had gotten so bad 3 days after 9/11, I couldn't walk from my den to my bedroom. About 20 feet. Imagine not being able to walk out of this room without having to stop to catch your breath. Didn't know what was going on. Mind you, I'm a trained medical professional. You would think that day changed my life forever. It took 10 years before the medications finally caught up with the effects of that day, and I can live somewhat a normal life on medication every day. Somewhat a normal life. But it changed me much more than it did physically. It changed me mentally. I wasn't a 19-year-old anymore. I had seen more horror, tragedy, atrocities, sheer unfathomable images in those 36 hours than people could ever see watching all the horror films in the world. I lived the biggest nightmare that this country has ever seen. Now, many people were affected by 9/11 in many different ways. I went to YU. My thought when I was going into YU was I'd be a Rebbe in the morning, get a degree in computer science, be involved in computers in the afternoon. Sounded like a very straightforward plan. On that day, I knew HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved me for something else. That day changed my life forever. It became very clear to me. It's funny, we used to joke in Eretz Yisrael. All my chaverim, my rebbeim in yeshiva made fun of me. Why? I was always the guy who was planning 5 years, 10 years out. And they always told me, Rabos machshavos b'lei vish. Right? Man has many different ideas and thinks he knows what's going on. V'atzas Hashem yisachim. Kadosh Baruch Hu only really knows what the plan is. The plan was that day to change my life. The plan was that day to learn, little things in life shouldn't bother you. To focus not on yourself and what you need, but to live your life wondering what you could do for others. That day didn't cause me to second guess my joining and becoming a first responder. It caused me to very much reinvest. I stopped my YU schooling. I became a paramedic. I left YU to go to John Jay to get a degree in public administration. And I live every day wondering what I can do with the gift HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me to help other people. My wife says I don't know how to say no. I don't think I'm allowed to say no. My day could have ended those 15 years ago. That could have been the last day of my life. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me more days since. And those are a gift that have to be spent helping Klal Yisrael and helping the world and being focused on Gimnos Chasadim. Thank you.
Girls, we have a few minutes if anybody has any questions.
I have a question. I thank you for sharing that. You have a unique perspective, and even though your experiences were that of a first responder, in many ways you shared the same experiences as other people who lived through it, not knowing who was alive and how to reach people and the chaos and the pandemonium and the heartache that was involved in that day. So thank you for sharing with us. You ended by talking about how you walked away with this need to give and how that has become the center of your life. One thing I remember hearing a lot about was the incredible chesed that happened on 9/11 and around Ground Zero for the months afterwards, especially in the first 48 hours. Tents were put up, delis were bringing over food, people were bringing over kosher food, non-kosher food for the rescue workers. There was, and YU students, in addition to the Hatzalah members that went down, YU students and Stern Girls were going down to do shmirah for people's remains, unfortunately, who were uncovered. So could you talk a little bit about, and we heard a lot about the chesed that you did, which was enormous, but then there were people that were doing chesed for you, like that boat that came to save you. It was just a feeling of the whole city pulling together. I don't know if you want to speak about that for a moment.
Sure. It was the one time that I can remember in my relatively short life that there were no differences anymore. Everyone was united against the same purpose. We realized that we were all one. Anyone who owned the store was bringing out water, chips, whatever food it was that they could provide. Sporting goods stores were immediately running to give goggles, masks, any supply stores that had anything that could
Sneakers,
be
right?
beneficial.
They were giving away sneakers too.
Sneakers, all different types of stuff. The only stuff that I really experienced were masks, water, and chips. That was the only thing I lived on for many hours. It was a while till the kosher food got down there. They weren't even letting people down at the time. But that was the only reason I was able to hydrate at all, because people gave. And that water, I'll tell you, water never tasted so good after having all that soot and dust in your mouth.
Any other questions, ladies? I'm going to ask,
Coach, I think we have a question.
okay,
What was the third rumbling that you heard when you were talking about it?
There was a building that was actually unstable, and it was swaying. The September 12th was a remarkably windy day, and it was the shifting of some of the rubble that was actually causing the ground to shake again.
The third building didn't come down?
They thought that 1, 2, and 7 were pretty much gone at that point.
Right, so 7 did come down, right? There was a third building that came down.
It came down as part of the second tower coming down, basically brought it down with it. But there was another building literally across the street that they thought would come down as well. Didn't come down, thank God.
So that you take medication every day. So do you think that 9/11 plays a role in your everyday life?
I would tell you not only from the medicine I take anymore. Never forget that experience. I take 9/11 with me every day. I spoke last night at our shul dinner, which very painstakingly and very upsettingly was scheduled on 9/11. And that's the message I tried to get people to understand. 9/11 is not a day in history. For those people who were affected by 9/11, whether it's the loss of a loved one or the mental or physical effects of the day, we feel it every day. I can't get sick without it having a much bigger effect on my body. A simple respiratory infection that someone would take antibiotics could be debilitating for me and my ability to function.
You said like people didn't really have cell phones, so like people outside the city like they hear about the.
So it was a time where now if you want to know something, you just have Twitter or any other sort of app on your phone that gives you news. Back then, people actually watched the news and listened to the radio.
The rest of the world stopped that day. I was just a regular civilian that day. I was a teacher, and there was literally a television running in the school library. Some teachers were choosing to teach. Some teachers were choosing to take their class in to watch the footage. It was a high school, it wasn't an elementary school, so it wasn't quite as scary. But I know I left work in the middle of the day that day to go to my kids' school to make sure that they were okay. And don't forget, nobody knew when the planes were going to stop falling out of the sky. It was a fun day. I didn't think they were after our little school, per se, but you didn't know what was going to come next. It was a very unnerving day, and everyone was glued to their television sets, and life just stopped. And nobody went to work the next day. Manhattan was empty. Manhattan was empty. The stock market closed for maybe, I think, the longest period ever on record. Nobody could go to work. Nobody went to work. Everybody just sat around waiting for something else to happen.
Go ahead.
You mentioned that you've never been back to Ground Zero since you haven't even been to the memorial.
The closest I went was about a year after 9/11. Hatzalah was putting together a video. In preparation, we had a Suda Soda for Kadosh Baruch for the fact that none of the Hatzalah members lost their lives that day. And they were putting together a video recounting what had transpired, and the pile was still there. And we went a few blocks away to record a video. I go to Lower Manhattan frequently as part of my work, but I can't go into the museum because there's a lot of shilas on McCohen, believe it or not. So there's a lot of shilas regarding the museum in of itself, and specifically being at Ground Zero, there's many questions as to whether they really got everything and whether it's considered a tour.
Girls, I don't know how many of you registered that comment. You heard about all the Hatzalah members that were trapped, that radioed in, we can't breathe, there's smoke, we're burning. And yet, did you register that not one Hatzalah member lost their life? That's huge.
There were police officers, firemen.
Every other rescue unit
The
that went in there.
only agency that was there at the initial response that didn't have a single.
Am I correct? Was Hatzalah the first ambulance at the scene?
Was that yours?
One of the East Side ambulances.
We,
Yeah.
oh, that was
Lower East Side ambulances. We were pretty
early.
early. We got hit by the wave of the people running out. I think that's what kept our ambulance from being caught in the debris pile.
Just to put one more thing two more things into perspective for you. My brother was so new on Hatzalah that as soon as I heard about it, I called my father and I said, "Is Mommy okay?" Because my mother had been working in the city for years. What is he doing at Ground Zero? Why would he be affected? Why is he nowhere near Ground Zero? And my father's response was, "Yes, and so is your brother." The girls that
About 200 blocks away, right? YU's got to be at least 200 blocks away from Ground Zero, at least, if not more.
That comment from my father hit me, still does, like a ton of bricks. The other thing, how many of you have parents that work in Manhattan? Girls, I don't think you realize that some parents couldn't get home for a few days because they were stuck. There was no transportation.
They shut everything down.
Out, definitely not in, but even out of the city, it was very hard to get out of the city.
People were walking.
That's why they were giving away sneakers.
They were walking over Williamsburg Bridge. They were walking over the Brooklyn Bridge. They were just walking. there were 500,000 people who were evacuated on September 11th by boat in New Jersey. 500,000 people.
Whether they lived in New Jersey or not.
They were
Just get on the boat.
When the towers came down, you were cut off. You were on one side of the incident or on another. And if you were on the other side of the incident, you were on the south side, there was nowhere to go. People had to face the thought of jumping into the Hudson rather than get buried. And on that day, the Coast Guard put out a call, and you'll see, you can find it very easily on the smartphones we all have now, the images, the aerial images from the helicopters of hundreds and hundreds of boats rushing to Battery Park to evacuate people.
And then the people that did have cell phones, every single person in the world was calling every single person they knew who lived or worked in Manhattan. Not just your mother and your father, and because you were a responder, I called my family in New York to make sure everybody was okay. And everybody called everybody that they knew that worked in Manhattan. So what do you think happens to cell phone service?
I don't think they'll found it.
What?
I don't think they'll get it.
What do you think happens when every single person picks up their phone at the very same time? Forget that the tower happened to be on top of the World Trade Center. In general, the circuits were just jammed.
It's like everyone in this room, if I told you to all run through that door at the same exact time.
Yeah.
That's what it would be like.
Right. The cell phone circuit said, oh, can't do this. So you really